Hello, colleagues. It's 1 o'clock and we have a pretty intense agenda, so I think we will start. My name is Alanus Soroyan. I'm the president of MAUT this year. I'm happy to welcome all of you to this very important session. The events last spring that led to Professor Andrew Potter's resignation as the director of the McGill Center for the Study of Canada unsettled our community profoundly. We heard voices from various individuals and groups who expressed concern about the meaning, value, and limitations that academic freedom has in our institution and the merit and strength of the McGill Statement of Academic Freedom. Formal responses to questions put forward in our Senate to Principal Fortier and to the Board of Governors and official media releases concerning the case signaled to us that there is a dire need to raise awareness about academic freedom, especially an awareness of the diversity in our own views, and to identify concerns and to explore options that would lead to an unambiguous interpretation of the concept of academic freedom in general and our academic freedom statement in particular. The idea of having an open forum that would stimulate an open debate on academic freedom came about at that time. And an MAUT working group took on the responsibility to plan this forum. We hope that the format and the contributions from our speakers will generate a rich discussion that could usefully inform MAUT Executive and Council about any actions that need to be taken to ensure that academic freedom is safeguarded at McGill. We also hope that this conversation will contribute to broader discussions on academic freedom in Canadian universities and in the academy in general. I want to say something about the format of this workshop. You all have hopefully picked up the program. You'll see that in the inside page there is the specifics of the program, and we have printed a copy of the academic freedom statement adopted by our Senate in 2017, and also on the back page, CAUT's policy statement on academic freedom for academic administrators. So we are delighted that Professor Neil Guppy has accepted our invitation to provide a general framework on the concept of academic freedom. I hope he'll draw on some cases to elaborate his points of views. After his address, we are fortunate to have 6 incredible panelists, and in order for us to make this a reasonable and possible conversation, we have asked our panelists to focus their initial comments on one question. And the question is there a justification for imposing limits on what an academic administrator may say in public, limits that would not apply to a regular professor in exercising his or her academic freedom? So each panelist will address, will address this question for 8 to 10 minutes, and then there'll be time for the panelists to interact with one another. Then there'll be an opportunity for you, the audience, to pose questions to any of the panelists and to anybody, basically. I want to remind our audience that this forum is about academic freedom and not about a particular case. So in posing your questions, please keep this in mind. Also, a reminder that the session is being videotaped. If anybody objects to being on videotape, we can edit out. Please let me know after the workshop. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to acknowledge the contributions of 2 groups of people. The first group was the initial group who drafted our academic freedom statement that was adopted almost intact by our university. These individuals are Jane Aitkins, John Galati, Brendan Gillen, Ian Henderson, and Danielle Weinstock. I'd like to also acknowledge the work that the group that was tasked to put this forum together and the time they spent on doing this. Again, Brendan Gillen, Ian Henderson, John Galati, Ken Hastings, Terry Ebert, and Axel Vanderberg, and myself. Okay, so moving on to our presenters, I'm just going to take a minute to introduce them, and then I'll ask them to come to the front. Neil Guppy is a professor of sociology at the University of British Columbia and the acting principal of Vantage College and the senior advisor to the provost on academic freedom. He is a graduate of Queen's University and the University of Waterloo. His research interests include social inequality, especially class, ethnicity, and gender, work and occupations, and education. He's the author of several books, including Education in Canada, The School Society, and recently his work on public opinion and immigration has appeared in the American Sociological Review and International Migration Review, and a paper on science policy in Canadian Public Policy. A forthcoming piece is on gender equity revolution in Canada, which will appear in the Canadian Review of Sociology. He is the recipient of 2 Gillen Awards at UBC, one for teaching and one for faculty research. The panelists in alphabetical order are Brendan Gillen. He is a professor in the Department of Linguistics at McGill with a PhD degree in philosophy from MIT. He is a former president of our association and a former vice president external. And he's currently the member of CAUT's Academic Freedom and Tenure Committee. His research areas are in natural language semantics and the history of logic in South and East Asia. He's published several books on semantics, a reader by Oxford University Press, Logic in Earliest Classical India, and Grammatical Structures and Its Interpretation, which is a forthcoming book by MIT Press. We welcome Yves Gingras from UQAM. He's scientific director of the Observatory of Science and Technology and professor of history and Canada Research Chair in History and Sociology of Science. His research covers the transformation of the university's science policy, research evaluation, and the dynamic of scientific disciplines. His most recent books are Bibliometrics and Research Evaluation, Uses and Abuses, published by MIT Press, and Science and Religion, An Impossible Dialogue by London Polity Press. Also welcoming Eve Haak, who is associate professor in the Department of Languages and Literatures and Linguistics at York University, and outgoing director of the graduate program in social and political thought. She has served on the board of the Association of Canadian Studies and is currently on the advisory board for the Canadian Association of Cultural Studies. Her research and teaching interests include multiculturalism, migration, and language policy, with a focus on the regulation and media representation of racialized immigrants in white settler societies. She's also the author of Multiculturalism within a Bilingual Framework, Language, Race, and Belonging in Canada by University of Toronto Press. Our next panelist is Jacob Levy. He is a Tomlinson Professor of Political Theory and Professor of Political Science and Associate Faculty in the Department of Philosophy at McGill. He is the coordinator of the research group on constitutional studies and of the Groupe de Recherche Interuniversitaire en Philosophie Politique, and the founding director of McGill's Yan P. Lin Center for the Study of Freedom and Global Orders in the Ancient and Modern Worlds. He is the author, most recently, of Rationalism, Pluralism, and Freedom, and is Professor Levy is a senior fellow at the Niskanen, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Center in Washington. Our next panelist is Rene Sieber. She's an associate professor in the Department of Geography and a member of our MAUT Council. She is not only a professor of geography and environmental, jointly appointed, but a member of her research seeks to increase democratic engagement through technological innovation and government-citizen interactions. She is best known for her research on public participation, geographic information systems, and has authored a definitive literature review which has been cited almost 900 times. In March 2013, Sieber was awarded the Government of Canada Social Sciences Humanities Partnership Grant to investigate how the geospatial Web 2.0 crowdsourcing, citizen science, and open data are transforming the ways citizens and cities interact. In recognition of her contribution to geographic information science in Canada, last year she was awarded the Lifetime Achievement and GI Science Excellence Award by the Canadian Association of Geographers. Our final panelist is Danielle Weinstock. He's a James McGill professor, member of McGill's Faculty of Law since 2012, and director of the McGill Institute for Health and Social Policy since 2013. He is also a member of the Centre d'études ethniques des Universités Montréalaises. He received his BA and MA in political science and political philosophy at McGill and received a DPhil in political philosophy from Oxford University and continued with postdoctoral work at Harvard and Columbia. In 2017, he was awarded the Charles Taylor Prize for Excellence in Policy Research by the Broadbent Institute. He's been a Rockefeller Fellow at Princeton, Prize Fellow of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, and recipient of the Prix André Laurendeau from the Association Canadienne-Française pour l'Avancement des Sciences. Weinstock's main research interests at present have to do with the problem of health equity and with issues of justice and inclusion as they arise in the organization of modern cities. The guiding thread of his research has been to connect philosophical and ethical argument with institutional reasoning. He has published many articles on the ethics of nationalism, problems of justice and stability in multinational states, the foundations of international ethics, and the accommodation of cultural and moral diversity with liberal democratic societies. He's also been an active participant in public policy in Quebec, having been a member of a Ministry of Education working group on religion in public schools and the founding director of Quebec's Public Health Ethics Committee.
So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I probably should start by saying that in some sense I'm coming home. I didn't ever realized this until, I'm not sure it was Aaron Shore, but somebody came to visit the sociology department at UBC and pointed out that when UBC first began, it was actually a college of McGill. And so our initial beginnings in the early 1900s were as a subsidiary, I'm not sure that's the right word to use here, of McGill University. So it's great to be back here. I'm going to talk about a very high-level set of ideas that really speak to the diversity of academic freedom. You'll know as I move towards the end of this talk that I have a particular view, and that particular view I know will show through. But this is a very, very contentious issue. There are lots of different ideas about exactly what academic freedom should be, and these different books in some ways illustrate much of that. Hopefully on the table, so that you can follow along with me, you've got a handout of what I'm going to talk about. The reason for giving you that is there are some slides that you'll notice I don't spend a lot of time on. This is a bad teaching moment here, by the way. There are some slides I don't spend a lot of time on, and those are the slides I don't particularly understand myself. So I want to kind of glide past a couple of controversial issues fairly rapidly. But hopefully, I'm not going to read slides. You'll get a sense of what's happening. So it's multimedia in the sense that I'm talking and you're reading slides, and between the two of them, I'm hoping you'll get a sense of what it is that I want to say. Oh, that was an outline of what I hope to be able to achieve. Here are a couple of caveats. I went to an economist, I've been to several economist talks, and economists, at this point in time, somebody would have interrupted me. In sociology, that tends not to happen. So I'm not sure what the norms are at McGill, but I'm more than willing to be interrupted as we go along. I'm a prof, and at least at UBC, many profs just go for 50 minutes or an hour and 20 minutes, whatever the time is, and don't stop to even breathe. So, no Hollywood ending here. But on the other hand, as I listened to the distinguished panel that's going to be here, I thought, whoa, there might be a great ending. My ending is not going to be a Hollywood or Bollywood ending, but maybe at the end of the day, we will have a kind of riveting conclusion to ideas here. So let me start, in some sense, by contrasting the two book covers that are up here. The one that's on your left, talking about academic freedom, I think is showing a picture of a community of scholars looking through a telescope, getting a sense of some heavenly bodies out there and trying to make some sense of it, really emphasizing the idea of a community of scholars seeking the truth. The book on the right, on the other hand, a very different kind of version of academic freedom, really is equating academic freedom with free speech. And those, to some extent, are the kind of polar ends of much of the debate here. I'm not going to quite use that binary all the way through. And to tell you, so I'm not holding secrets, I lean more to the left in terms of the picture, than I do with respect to this being an issue of free speech or freedom of expression, as we talk about it here in Canadian circles. So first of all, very, very little legal work that has been done on this. So if you go and look through the legal decisions that have been made in Canada around academic freedom, you find very few, and the ones that you do find, I personally think, are pretty vague. They're not really clear tests, clear statements that give us tremendously good clarity as we move forward. It's one of the first things to say. No widely accepted definition. So the McGill statement that was pointed out, I read through that and thought, hey, wow, top marks to McGill. In comparison to many others, especially the one at UBC, it's a very good statement and seems to, I think, hit a lot of the core issues. I'll talk about what I see as some of those core issues in a minute here, but I do want to emphasize that there isn't an accepted definition, and we could get lots of different academics coming from different points of view, acting as expert witnesses, saying, oh no, it means this, and oh no, it means that. And those 13 books early on, every one of those authors, I think, would disagree as to exactly what academic freedom is. Why is it so difficult? There are some reasons as to why there is no accepted definition. Like many concepts in the academic world, it's very contested. And especially this notion of criticism is intellectual life. Well, that's what everybody in this room is about, and that's one of the core reasons that academic freedom doesn't have this, this kind of rooted footing. The authority or attack on science, war on knowledge, however, I think that makes it at this particular juncture a very, very important issue to focus on. 1915 in the States, this is the American Association of University Professors. Almost everybody will go to the definition that they outlined there and that has gradually been reformed a little bit or restated in various ways as we've moved forward. Really, it is the disinterested pursuit of truth. That's where they started. More somewhat nuanced versions now might talk about it as understanding as the core thing that we're after. This is some attacks that have taken place on truth, and I'll come to these in a little bit. The dimensions of academic freedom at the bottom are really, to me, the core issues of this slide. And I just want to work through each of those, and you'll get right away a sense of why this is a contested concept. So the freedom to pursue knowledge claims of whatever sort. Well, at UBC, one of the things we're wrestling with at the moment is one of my colleagues wants to do research on mercury and vaccines. Now, many of my colleagues say, come on, that issue was settled decades ago. Why are we bringing this back now? And if you've been reading the press, why are we bringing it back now in a way that might be fraudulent? Because there seems to be possibly some manipulation of data that's taken place there. So anyway, the point here is not the fraud. That I think is kind of getting in the way of the other question. Where is the boundary as to what constitutes a knowledge claim that's worth pursuing? And intellect and racism would be another one. Many people in the room will be familiar with Philip Rushton at Western and his desire to pursue intelligence levels for different racial groups. Was that an issue that was settled a long time ago, and why are we revisiting it? So this is another that makes it contentious. Just what is a knowledge claim? Tenure to protect research of legitimate kinds. I probably should say it's not just the idea of knowledge seeking here, but as I'll talk about in C and D here, it's also the dissemination of that knowledge. What is the legitimate kinds of knowledge that we ought to be pursuing and disseminating? And who makes those decisions? Am I, as an individual scholar, able to say, no, pursuing mercury and vaccines, that's my choice, and I should be able to go forward and do that? Or is there some sense in which my community ought to have some say in what I'm doing? Collegial governance and the critique of the administration. Just how important is collegial governance to what we do? As I'll come to say later, this is a fairly unique occupation in which we all work, and why should we have that right to be able to criticize the administration, which would not exist if I were to work with BlackBerry, for example, or if I were to work with Alcan. Much greater limits on what I could say about the particular organization in which I work. And the final one, the ability to be able to participate freely in public life. And this goes to some extent to the question that we're debating here. As I was first introduced to that whole issue, I was reminded of the president at UBC, Martha Piper. And Martha was very fond of saying over and over and over again, she might hold opinions, but the university doesn't hold opinions. But the distinction that she kept making was, I can't say anything, and people understand it as my opinion, because I'm the president of UBC. So that position kind of dominates the speech that she engages in. It can never be, she can never make the defense that, oh no, that's just my view on the war in Afghanistan, or that's just my view on abortion, or it's just my view on niqab. I am in a position where people will never make that distinction. We might, as academics, make a fine-grained distinction here. Members of the general public will not. So person and position, very different. And then to some, I better not go on about this. Let me move on. Like a prof, I sometimes go off on tangents, so hopefully I'll shut up most of the time. Oh yeah, so the other here is these statements, kind of where do they exist and what kind of force do they have? So I'll tell you just a little story around this. It won't be a little story, but anyway. At UBC we had some controversy when our president was asked to resign, decided to resign, stepped down. This is Arvind Gupta, and one of my colleagues, Jennifer Bardal, wrote a blog commenting on this and evidence as to why this may or may not have occurred, and talked about it, not get too graphic, but as a kind of masculine pissing contest between a white male chair of the board and Arvind Gupta, a visible minority president of the university. So was she, in speaking that, in saying that, was she going beyond her rights as a university professor? So we had a big investigation by a former justice of the BC Supreme Court. And one of the things that, that Lynn Smith did in her report is she referred to our statement in the calendar passed by Senate on academic freedom. So I went to a meeting with our lawyers, our legal counsel, basically to talk about academic freedom. One of the points they made to me, which still scratch my head about, is, well, you know, that statement actually appears in, and the lawyers in the room here will catch this, in the recitals of our collective agreement. It's not actually ever been negotiated in our collective agreement. It's sort of like the preamble of the book. I'm not sure whether preambles of books are reviewed, but the book is reviewed, but maybe the preamble isn't. The collective agreement is negotiated, but the preamble or the recitals aren't. So Smith talked about the recitals as though these were things that had been negotiated. And our university council, no, never should have happened. So that's another part, is where this gets kind of controversial. Where exactly are these assertions embedded? Thankfully, the McGill one was passed by Senate, as opposed to just being something that was offered by the administration or just offered by a group, maybe MAUT or by an association or whatever. It's got some force because Senate at least was behind it. So some of these are, as our university council people talk about, just aspirational statements, and some of them are actual statements that have been passed and agreed to by different bodies within the university. I'll come back to this at the end because this is where things get controversial around respectful environment, around discrimination and harassment. Anyway, yeah, you can see to a extent where I'm going there. Who does this apply to? This is another big, so here, what's the first question I got as the senior advisor to the provost on academic freedom? Somebody at the back of a room like this put their hand up and said, does this apply to staff? And ooh, my, I hate to say this, but I didn't know. I'd read our academic freedom statement, and I was kind of caught off guard by this, and thankfully I had a junior colleague that was there from our philosophy department who said, oh yeah, it applies to everybody. And I said, okay, good. Now it said it right there in the statement. It said all members of the university, but I hadn't quite parsed it quickly enough to catch exactly what that meant. So at UBC, the statement on academic freedom appears in the calendar, says all members of the university. And that's clearly faculty members, some sessionals, librarians, etc. Students, everybody will agree to that. Staff members, yes, everybody kind of nods and thinks, okay, yeah, they are members of the university. Jordan Peterson is being invited to speak, the controversial psych prof from U of T. He's coming to visit next week, I think it is. So is he protected by our academic freedom statement? Yes, absolutely, because he's an invited member of from the academic community. So we have a very broad sense. Similar, McMaster's is up there, and the McGill one, I'm not sure by exactly what's meant, the scholarly members of the university, yeah. So does that include students? Are they scholarly members? Some people will say no. They might be junior scholars, but they really don't have the kind of academic wisdom that everybody in this room has. They're just learning that wisdom. So how could they have academic freedom? So again, pretty contentious kind of issue as to who exactly it applies to. I do want to make, and I'll come back to this distinction, individual. So we all kind of have a sense of individual sense of our academic freedom, but to some extent the institution also needs to have some sense of academic freedom, so it can withstand incursions by government. I'll come back to talk about that around the charter, I hope. Okay, what is it here? I'm kind of making the obvious point in the first one. It applies to individuals in a variety of ways. The university autonomy, often this is Senate or the board that will provide a kind of collective agreement around issues. Maybe the fourth one is the easiest one to understand. I don't decide who gets into UBC. Probably none of you decide exactly who gets into McGill. It's a collective agreement, so it is, in that sense, academic freedom embedded in the institution to make decisions about who can and cannot be accepted for admission to the university. So that's the distinction I'm trying to make at that second level, institutional and individual. And then the self-governance rights. Is this something that's necessary or not necessary? This, again, in this literature around academic freedom is highly debated. Some people saying, you know, this really is a privilege that university folks have, and it's something that other workplaces don't have. How can we justify it? And how far does that boundary go, right? How many coffee shops do you need? How close should the parking be to your office? I mean, I don't want to be trivial, but there are some of these things, at least at UBC, that our colleagues are saying, hey, that's academic freedom, right? I ought to have some say in the making of these decisions. We're just putting a parking lot in the middle of campus. It's causing a bit of controversy because it's there for donors, right? Because it's right next to the alumni center. So anyway, I better not go there, but bit of controversy around that. So is it more than freedom of expression, right? So I made that on one of the very first slides, that kind of contrast between community and free speech or freedom of expression ideas. And I'm trying to give on number 2, yes, and how does it differ? And here I'm showing my cards a little bit. To what extent is it quality control that we're talking about with respect to academic freedom here? If freedom is if freedom is being modified by academic, and I think it is, it's not just all freedoms, it's academic freedom. Well, what does that academic actually mean? And Stanley Fish has done some really interesting stuff that kind of messed my mind up reading his work around this with respect to exactly what it does and doesn't mean, and a whole variety of different ways of thinking about that modifier. I think I've said everything I really want to say there. To some extent, if we allow academic to be a disciplining force, then in some sense it's less than freedom of expression, because my colleagues are going to say to me, no, you can't make those kinds of statements because a sociologist doesn't have the ability to talk about the exact mechanisms whereby mercury might influence vaccines. I could probably talk about the science around this and the policy kinds of issues, but there's going to be a line at which my expertise is no longer going to hold. Well, God, who makes that decision as to where that line might be and when it does and doesn't get crossed? But there's a kind of academic responsibility part to that, right? Two sides to the coin. Former UBC President David Strangway loved to be able to say, yeah, we've all got tenure. Tenure is a great thing. Academic freedom respects it. But if you're not being responsible and actually doing academic things, I don't know that it should be as respected as maybe you think it should be respected. So the idea there of responsibility to actually engage, to actually be involved in research, to actually be teaching, to actually be doing things to contribute to the community is very, very important. So two sides of the coin would be the way Strangway would often talk about it. Most of us in this room, I suspect all of us in this room, are also under the strictures of codes of ethics, accreditation boards, a whole variety of other professional standards. I've listed the one here for sociology, but we could put ones up for people in medicine, for people in law, for people in civil engineering, etc., all of which apply in many ways much like academic freedom applies. This starts then to get to the sort of messiness of, right, whose rules count the most when we get to specific sorts of decisions here. This is a slide I'm going to skip over because I looked at it this morning and thought, what exactly is that about? So I think I'm just rehearsing what I had said previously. I don't know that there's anything new and thrilling in this particular slide. What's academic about academic freedom? So let me point to a specific example that this really kind of resonated with me. Why do we teach the theory of evolution and not creation science? So if this was freedom of expression, I wouldn't be able to say to my colleagues in science, nope, you can't teach creation science, or all my colleagues couldn't say that. Because somebody could say, well, that's just freedom of expression. That's all that's going on here. Now, probably like most people in the room, many people in this room might have read the book, what's it called, The Beak of the Finch, I think. Is that, anybody read that book? Yeah, is that the right title? I think it is. Anyway, it's a very, very good book, worth reading. It's all I know about the theory of evolution, because what it tries to do, the Beak of the Finch changes on the islands in the Galapagos as climate differs, as the environment changes. And so what it does is showing evolution changing with respect to natural selection. Holy moly. Anyway, please don't ever quote me on that. I'm not sure how accurate that is. But my point, let me get to my point, is basically I trust science. I trust that this theory of evolution is a scientific theory and that there is scientific evidence to support that, and that's why I nod and agree, and if I were on Senate would vote and say, yes, that ought to be on the curriculum of this university. Creation science, on the other hand, is not science, and academic freedom is one that's going to be saying, no, that's not something that gets taught within the university. My point here is just to make sure that we understand the key distinction between freedom of expression or free speech in the States and this notion of academic freedom. And again, I'm showing my academic community cards here as the way of defining what constitutes academic freedom. So this is Thomas Haskell. So if you ever read anything in the literature, he's a prof in history, I think, at Rice, or was a prof in history at Rice, and wrote a really, really nice piece on academic freedom in the late 90s, excuse me. So the key quote here, no one from outside the academic community is fully competent to pass judgments on matters falling within the domain of the academic communities. And this goes to communities as represented by disciplines. I want to make sure I come back to this because your McGill statement has something about disciplinary orthodoxies and that those shouldn't trample academic freedom is the implication. Well, there's some tension here as to what exactly is the idea of disciplinary orthodoxy and how might that apply. Here's academic about academic freedom. Once again, I think I've made the freedom of expression point already. My academic liberties, this is going back to the point of working at a university. They apply because I'm employed at a university, not because I work with ALCAN, not because I work at some particular think tank or with the federal government or whatever it might be. So in that sense, I think it's important to understand the context, the university context in which we're working as a way of contextualizing the kinds of freedoms that we may have. And then the third point is just emphasizing yet again that disciplinary point about where authority is being exercised here. Who is it that's demonstrating that this constitutes knowledge seeking, legitimate knowledge seeking, the pursuit of valid knowledge claims, etc. And here's the paradoxical nature of that then. I'm sure some of you are sitting there thinking about that. On the one hand, we encourage people to come up with new ideas, to be bold, have conjectures that are new and different. On the other hand, it's the disciplines themselves that are saying, yes, that is the kind of conjecture that a sociologist can pursue, or that a zoologist can pursue, or that somebody in medicine can pursue around mercury and and vaccines. So there's a kind of enabling and constraining point here. There's a sociology talk a little bit. And then the Joan Scott quote at the bottom, which I quite like as a way of kind of catching that paradox. But that paradox to me is one that's very, very difficult to be able to resolve. And I don't personally think any of our statements about it really resolve it in a clear way. And we don't have the legal decisions in Canada that resolve that in a clear way. It's murky and messy. And why is it that the courts may not have made these kind of firm statements that Neil Guppy might love to have seen? Well, because this is murky and difficult terrain, and they are pretty smart people who don't want to be able to wade into something where it could be very, very contentious. That's a possible explanation. I think I've made this point, who decides. I'm just re-emphasizing the professions and the disciplines kind of point here. Now, here's a kind of point I do want to make sure that we understand, that when it comes to freedom of expression, my freedom of expression at UBC is quite constrained, it turns out. Right? I'm not free to be able to say a whole variety of different things because of agreements that my colleagues have made about how my teaching is going to be evaluated, about the kinds of standards that would apply in a classroom, about grading kinds of things I'm supposed to mark with respect to some degree of natural justice, so that students in my section don't get higher scores than students in my other sociology, or lower scores. So a variety of ways in which there is constraint of freedom of expression taking place here. At McGill, and this is just to go back to the statement that I was raising earlier around this academic freedom, freedom to pursue research and artistic creation without being constrained by disciplinary orthodoxies. So, you can read that in a couple of different ways. What exactly is a disciplinary orthodoxy, right? It kind of be a very conservative kind of influence in zoology or in sociology or in economics, or it could be, we want these to be economic statements. We want these to be kind of statements of science that a medical person would make, and that's the kind of orthodoxy of the discipline. So that's a vague kind of notion that is in that statement. Here's back to the 1915 Declaration. This was basically just to say it was written by lots of people across the university. Still is quoted over and over as the key idea. Here I'm just making the two-level point again, but now I'm pointing to just what is the university about. And so I quote Edward Shills. Tons of people have made similar kinds of statements. We have a distinctive task in the university, the methodical discovery and teaching of truths about serious and important things. So how do we justify that? Right? If academic freedom is critical to the idea that this is what universities do, how do we go about justifying that academic freedom is something that ought to be a core, an essential operating principle to us as individuals within universities? So we need freedom to be able to pursue these scientific matters. And two of them that kind of leap out, I'm sure, at everybody right away. Mill's notion about seeking truth. This is the best way to do it, to have lots of competing ideas, and truth will rise to the surface, rise to the top, just like cream. And then protection from oppression or censorship, and that's a protection that should go across the board for everybody. So Galileo, climate change deniers, I probably could have put up there, mercury and vaccine researchers. So this again gets very, very contentious because it is line drawing, and it's something that many academics, at least in the social sciences, wince about when it occurs. The core argument here, the ends justify the means because we're seeking truth. Academic freedom is something that gives us a greater ability to get to the truth because we've got that exchange of ideas that's taking place, and that's going to ensure that we're pursuing all of the different ideas that exist and are out there. It is, as the drafters of the 1915 statement put it, the first condition of progress. So the first condition of progress is to ensure that universities are protected with this notion of academic freedom. And maybe I've gone on about this 1915 statement a little bit. It's a kind of interesting statement written in 1915, but all of those books that I talked about, I think it's fair to say all of those books that I talked about all go back to that statement as being a really defining moment. So it's a kind of core statement written in the States, but is understood to apply in its at least abstract way around the globe, really. And it's academic freedom, again, just kind of making that last point. The institutional part of academic freedom, why should that, right? We can see why all of us as individuals might have academic freedom, that exchange of ideas, etc. Why should the institution have academic freedom here? And there are, I think, immediate things that will come to mind. Well, here's a corporation that's going to give us a little bit of money. We don't want them dictating what the research should be. More contentious one is, and I don't know the Quebec scene well enough, so I won't use McGill as an example. I'll use UBC as an example. Here's the government saying to us, we'd like to double the number of engineers that exist in the province. And I'm there as a sociologist thinking, wait a sec, we ought to double the number of sociologists. Well, who should decide that, right? Who should decide that we need twice as many engineers? And do we need twice as many engineers in mechanical and civil, or do we need twice as many software engineers? And should it be the government that's actually telling us that? Should our nursing program double? And if it doubles, right, where should that be? So there's one sense of me, one part of me that sort of thinks, yeah, you know, I've got one of these things like many of you do, and so yeah, we need more software engineers. And it's hard to, I hate to say this, but it's hard to hold up a sociologist and say, yeah, we need more of these to be able to do, and I'm not quite sure what I would point to, but well, it's coming in a later slide. But how does that decision get made, right? There is a sense of university autonomy there. And it's happened at McGill, I'm sure it's happened at UBC. You shouldn't appoint this kind of professor. I talked about Martha Piper earlier. We had Sunaya Thibani at UBC, very critical, kind of 20 days after the 9/11 attacks and the war of Afghanistan began. She made very, what some would say is radical statements about the war in Afghanistan, and others would say were kind of, wow, I'm glad somebody stood up and said, militarizing this is not the right solution, right? This north-south divide that we've got can be solved in other ways. That's basically what she said. But the donors at UBC were just all over the university immediately that we should never have allowed this kind of thing to be said, and certainly we don't want to taint the students at UBC with somebody who holds these particular views. And so we needed quite a defense of academic freedom in that particular case. So that's where this academic freedom at the institutional level, in the sense that the institution has to have some academic responsibility in ensuring that it protects the claims that individuals might make. And then pluralism, the sort of second point there, that in some sense we live in a society that's organized in a way that has a variety of different institutions that kind of act as checks and balances on one another. In law and the legal system, in the education system, in the, I've already said the criminal justice system, the medical system, et cetera, that all of those institutions play a kind of separate role, and the universities within that have a unique particular position here. Here's the collegial self-governance. Well, in some sense, you might go to many professions and say, well, the medical profession has collegial self-governance in it. They make all kinds of decisions about, in fact, how many medical doctors should be admitted into McGill and what kinds of training should they have. And so there is a sense in which other professions have something similar to what academics do. They don't have that similar context quite often in terms of how they operate if they're in a research and development center, for example. So this is just talking a little bit about why that collegial self-governance is important, but there becomes a question of just how far does that self-governance go? Where is it that we start to draw a line with respect to academic freedom? The notion of study halls for students, the notions of what our admission standards ought to be, the notions of the scholarships that we ought to pay, the notions of whether we should be admitting students that don't quite meet some of the English language standards that we have. Right? We start to shade into things that you start to wonder, do we as academics have the expertise even to make some of those latter kinds of distinctions? Okay, I think I've said enough about that. So I'm going to talk about internal and external challenges now, in a sense, to academic freedom. And in a way, I'm kind of picking on two, internal, external, not quite the right binary here maybe, but it's a nice way of summarizing this. So, and I'm pointing the finger at postmodernists here probably unfairly. I'm not a postmodernist, and so, but anyway, okay. So one is the whole notion of truth here. And some, I'm surprised, I don't know how a McGill audience will relate to this, but a couple of my colleagues at UBC objected to, as I first started talking, not about this particular slide, but started talking about truth. And that's why I've kind of changed it up here a bit, because their view was, what exactly is truth? I don't think we're pursuing truth, and they felt very uncomfortable about that. Now, have been very much influenced, as each of us have in different ways, but for me it was reading Thomas Kuhn. That kind of, the world changed when I read that book. It was that kind of gestalt switch that he talks about. And so I had a sense, right, truth is a community understanding. That's really what truth is all about. And it turns out the 1915 drafters of academic freedom had exactly that point. They basically were saying that this was a community that was deciding what constituted academic freedom, and they knew what were the right ways to pursue truth, the ways in which we could most conveniently get towards some idea of truth. The disciplinary deference kind of idea, to the extent here that more and more people are saying, wait a sec, disciplines are the dinosaurs of the university. We've got a president at the moment who talks about, well, we need to get rid of disciplines and we need to be much more problem-oriented. That's really where solutions lie. I'm exaggerating a bit. But a sense here that academic freedom as defined by disciplines is perhaps under attack or being chipped away a little bit by some notion of transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, et cetera, which I think is a good thing. I mean, I think the transdisciplinary thing is a good thing, but I do wonder a little bit about the academic notion of academic freedom that underlies that. And so many people are kind of worried when they write in these books about academic freedom, about this particular challenge to disciplines and how that may or may not influence what goes on. So in a way, the McGill statement is kind of ahead of its time in focusing on these disciplinary orthodoxies, which quite clearly postmodernist scholars point to and say, wait a second, sociology is just too stodgy and doesn't take up questions that it ought to be taking up because of its disciplinary stodginess, very conservative in its origins. And then political advocacy. The notion here, more and more of our colleagues on university campuses feel that knowledge mobilization, knowledge transmission entails some sense of political advocacy, and that gets some of our colleagues really riled up when they're starting to feel that people are making political statements as opposed to scholarly statements. And again, where you draw any kind of distinction between those, very, very difficult to understand. So I'm just going to keep talking here and hope that this comes back. The external challenges to academic freedom, I think several of these will be obvious to people. And here I'm borrowing from Michael Horn at York, who's written, probably the god on academic freedom in Canada. He talks about political and economic considerations. So the whole notion of this war on knowledge kind of idea, that we're seeing an undermining of the idea of academic scientific knowledge have any kind of value whatsoever, and the political correct posturing that's necessary. And there clearly is an attack on the academic world stemming from that notion of political correctness. We most often talk about money as power in corporations and governments, and I've talked about some of that already here. Maybe the other external challenge I should put up there, and this is one that's kind of only come to me recently, is, and I don't know how this is understood in Quebec or at McGill in particular, but should the Charter of Rights apply to the university? So as a sociologist, and probably kind of in the middle, but therefore on the left of the discipline with respect to other disciplines at least, I always thought, well, of course the Charter should apply to myself and my colleagues. But our university council across the country, I'm told, really resists this notion of the government and the Charter impinging on what universities do, because what that would allow, apparently, is governments to be able to dictate to us more and more. We would be, in that sense, an arm of government, because the Charter applies to government institutions, to government organization. And if we do have a Charter applying to us, then when our Premier says you should have more midwives, or you should have more sociologists, or you should have more civil engineers, they have every right to do that. When they say we should have a sexual assault policy, we should do that. Most of those things I kind of agree with. Yeah, we should do those. But I can easily think of other things. You should teach creation science, right? In British Columbia, the Abbotsford School Board decided they should do that. So I worry about government incursion in that sense and applying to, and the Charter having applied to us. Sociologists would generally talk about this as rationalization, and this whole process is one that everybody is familiar with. Whole notion of calculability, accountability, predictability, measurement. I mean, I started at UBC in 1979, and if I think one thing has changed over time, it's just more and more and more and more of this sense of rationalization. And you see it everywhere. Yields and patents and royalties, and just the way in which we couch many of the things that we do in our universities is all about that rationalization kind of idea, that calculability notion. I'm not going to talk about this, but the link between research and practice, that's in a way, sociologists don't do a lot of producing these kinds of things, but sociologists and other social scientists do a lot about producing people who are in the policy fields and have a variety of ways in which they influence policy and policy setting. The Naylor report, just to call out that Naylor report and say, hey, this is something going in exactly the right direction, trying to move us away from priority-driven research where the government says this is a priority or that is a priority, to much more investigator-led research. Whether we'll see that translate from the Naylor report, I'm not sure, but that's right, a kind of indirect way in which academic freedom is being infringed by governments saying in our granting councils, this is the kind of work that we'll support, not this other kind of curiosity-driven types of research. And maybe I should just make another little note there. One of my colleagues, Canada Research Chair at UBC, said to me the other day, you know where I get my academic freedom infringed the most? All this stuff you do, Guppy, is really nonsense to me. It's our ethics board. And I was kind of, our ethics board? And his point was, when I do research, I often find the ethics people coming back to me not with ethical concerns, but with research design concerns. You ought to design your research this way because this is a better way of doing whatever you're doing. So that's in a way, it illustrates to me the kind of, I don't know, invidious, if that's the right word. It's just a way in which this academic freedom stuff is just soaked through everything that we do. Okay, now where is it located? So this, I'm getting towards the end here, but right, if you, so somebody said to me again when I started this job, you know, where exactly do I find this academic freedom? And I said, well, look at the Senate. They read the Senate statement at UBC and came back to me and said, well, where is this defined and where is that defined and how do I understand this? And of course I couldn't answer that. And it's like the McGill statement, right? Most universities have a statement like this, but how enforceable it is it just an aspirational statement or is it a statement with some kind of clout behind it? I think for most universities, there are kind of good examples where people have stood up and said the right things, and there are bad examples where we've kind of fallen off the right approach to things. So it often includes statements of this sort in support of the university's integrity and fundamental mission, avoiding circumstances that may undermine public confidence and trust. So I can't do anything that's going to undermine public confidence and trust. Well, many of you will have done things that you kind of think, well, if that had been kind of on the front page of Le Devoir or the Gazette, that probably would have undermined some public confidence and trust. So how is it that these other policies kind of influence what's going on? Here are some examples of how these things might actually be undermining confidence and trust. And well, just to go back to them, some of them which are abhorrent and we ought not do, but others which you kind of look at and think, well, you know, consulting is a good thing, right? Getting people out there, consulting, whether it's on business issues or social policy issues or whatever. Doing it badly is not good, but doing it is something good. And again, where's that line come in terms of quality kinds of distinctions? Here are 3 examples of other sorts of policies: respectful work and learning environment, University of Manitoba; scholarly academic integrity from the Council of Canadian Academics; and harassment and discrimination from McGill. My point in putting these up here is just to ask, each of these are great in and of themselves, but don't they actually contradict some of the things that we're talking about with respect to academic freedom? So I mentioned Jordan Peterson coming to campus at UBC. One of the big debates that's taking place there is, should we ever have given a platform to Peterson to speak in the first place? I personally think, yes, absolutely we should have, but there are some colleagues saying, no, 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 we should have a platform veto. We shouldn't be inviting onto campus people who are going to make statements that we find divisive, that we find to be abhorrent. And I think, no, academic freedom is one that it ought to apply. So freedom of expression clearly ought to apply in that particular case. but wait a sec, Jordan Peterson is going to come and some of the statements he's going to make are going to make people feel uncomfortable. It's not going to be a respectful, dignified conversation. In some ways, his message is an attack on a particular group of people who are transgendered. And is this reasonable and fair? So our respectful environment people are all saying, no, 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 no. That's the policy that we ought to be focusing on here, not the academic freedom policy. And this has led to all kinds of consternation. I'm not sure where we're going to go. The president was about to issue a statement on freedom of expression, and now that's kind of gotten bogged down a little bit by, ooh, yeah, this is very tricky as to which of those statements ought to apply here. Okay, I think I've made everything there. I don't want to focus on the Mary Bryson case too much here. Mary was involved with Jordan Peterson as one of the panelists at U of T when this kind of first blew up. But one of the things I do want to say, and here, as somebody from a distance, I kind of look at McGill and think, I think you guys did this better than UBC did it. So Mary gets attacked in the National Post by Christy Blatchford, writes a column that is, I thought, despicable kind of thing, but was headline grabbing, trying to sensationalize a particular issue. And there was a petition circulated saying, we should defend Mary's right to be able to say what she said at University of Toronto, which we should do. And the irony in some sense is the university was doing this as the petition was being signed. But my worry a bit about this is a kind of bystander effect. And I'm probably more guilty maybe than anybody else in this room, and certainly at UBC. Everybody expected the administration to stand up for Mary, but I don't know a soul at UBC that actually wrote to the National Post or that said anything in a very public way defending Mary. It was all kind of, point to the university to do something. What I mean there by the bystander effect is we expected somebody else to do something. And towards the bottom here, I give some of the reasons that tends to occur more and more at universities. Now, around the Andrew Potter thing, I think colleagues at McGill stepped up more as individuals than occurred at UBC, that there was more of a sense of public outrage that occurred here. There was outrage at UBC, but it wasn't public in a way that really, really would have been useful. And a great quote from Horn, the mildew of discretion lies heavily on some professors still. And just above that, some reasons as to maybe why that mildew is still hanging on some of us. Okay, I'm just about to wrap up. Here's a kind of quick summary, I think, of everything I said. Here are references, plus all of those books on the first slide. And here are just some of the specific issues around academic freedom. And I could actually talk, I didn't do it here, but I have kind of illustrations of many of these, of how they kind of boil up as academic freedom issues. Not to say, here's how they all get resolved, but to say, here's how they're all controversial. Because to end, I guess I'd go back to the very first points where I started. This is a nice academic kind of issue, and when we get to the very specifics of what you're grappling with here, it gets very, very, very difficult. So I'm really looking forward to the rest of the afternoon. I don't know what time it is, I haven't got a clue here. Should I take questions or yeah? A couple of questions or comments might be even better. And please use the microphone here, because it's being taped, etc.
I don't know if it's on. Yes, I guess it is. I'm Ken. We met before. That was very interesting. I thought I knew a lot about academic freedom before you started talking. Now I feel like I know a lot less, and that so it's been very informative. But I wonder, at some point we have to make decisions, right? Now, and do you have any? I mean, you're dealing with the slippery nature and the edges. What do you think about what guides us making decisions about academic freedom? What do you use if you are given a dilemma, a specific case, like in the case of our specific question that we have to address today, on academic administrators? How do you just turn it loose on the floor, or do you feel like there are major themes that should be applied? Where would you go with that?
So I would look, so I'm going to use the UBC example as a case here. So for me personally, I think it's fair to say I knew next to nothing about academic freedom when I accepted this job about 15 months ago. And at the same time, Lynn Smith was investigating the Berdahl and Montalbano and Arvind Gupta case. And so what was very informative to me was her report and then how our university council responded to it. And I hate this about universities, please don't get me wrong, but this is the answer to your question, is what are the collective agreement standards? What are the Senate statements that have been made? Those, by and large, are going to rule the day. We can have respectful environment statements. We can have other proxy kind of things. I think I'm paraphrasing our university council here, but I think correctly. The respectful environment policy at UBC was passed by a committee, was agreed to by the executive, but doesn't really have any more weight than that. And what weight exactly is that? Well, it's certainly not the weight of the collective agreement. It's not the weight of something that has been passed by Senate. The problem is that what Senate at UBC has passed, and I think your statement as well, there really is a rub of where issues of respectful environment, dignity, etc. come, and where that statement comes around academic freedom. And I bet at McGill it would be people pointing to that statement. Now, when it comes to an administrator in a position, where is their ability to be able to speak? I don't think the McGill statement talks to that, the UBC statement doesn't talk to that, and I don't think most statements at most universities talk to that point. But that's where I would go, is to those.
And so just to circle back to that, because we'll be coming at the end to this, would you regard that as a particular case of a gap, as a lack, the fact that the UBC statement, that the McGill statement does not address this point? Or is there a long, long list, an infinitely long list of things that are not addressed?
So I think there is a fairly long list, and another way to kind of address that is, when I started the job at UBC, I did not expect the first 25 cases that came my way that were all from very different places, and none of them are addressed. So in one sense, as a sociologist, I think I'm aware that bureaucracies work much more by informal mechanisms. They don't work by kind of formal codified rules a lot, and that's what's happening around many of these things. It's getting messier and messier, and so we can't speak to the particular specifics that are there. So I'm not sure I'm answering the first part of what you just implied, but.
Maybe one more question, because we need to move on to the panel.
Hi, so I'll see you on the panel in a moment. I'm very concerned about our ability as researchers to participate in collegiality. And because our workloads are so high now, and because we're pressured to continually perform more students, more papers, we have to put our heads down and just do that. So do we have the academic freedom to push back against a paper count, a bean counting of our research every year, and the number of students we have to take every year?
So I want to answer yes to that, and one of the experts on the panel can at least address a part of that. But maybe I'll address it in two ways. So one, we don't have the ability to press back on our provincial governments and say, no, we can't take more students, because they really are doing bean counting or body counting, and it really is a bums in seats kind of exercise that we engage in. We really need to be able to go in a much more public relations way and say, look, the universities are doing something that's great, and here's our story, and we've done wonderful things, and we should be funded more. Difficult story to be able to convince voters who are in a tax-cutting mode to be able to do. Maybe the other point that I would make, maybe a touch more controversial, is it's you and I that decide whether that paper count's increasing, right? I mean, McGill, like UBC, will have a set of tenure and promotion standards, and it'll be faculty members that sit on that, and it'll be faculty members that kind of make decisions around that. So there's a way in which those groups could push back a little bit in terms of the paper counting kind of idea. But.
Thank you. There'll be opportunities for more questions at the end, so may I ask the panel to come to the table? Thank you very much.
Oh, okay, great.
No. I'm gonna ask the panelists to, in their initial comments, to stick to the 8 to 10 minutes max, to give us time. I know we went over time, but there's time to catch up. So, can we start with Brendan then?
Oops, sorry.
I think you need to find your.
Yeah.
What's the name of the document?
It's academic, this one here, the PDF.
The form.
Yeah.
Oops.
And I page down with this here, page up?
Yeah, down or to the right.
Okay, great. Just seeing how the microphone, okay, great. Well, I first want to say that I learned a lot from the last talk. I remember once as a graduate student being told about trying to get a drink from a fire hydrant turned on full force. So my talk will be short and be even shorter now because I think some of the points that I wanted to make have already been made. And it'll also go from the very broad to the very, very narrow. So I took the liberty of slightly altering the question. So the question is there any administrative position which, once occupied by a scholar, constrains his or her academic freedom? And my short answer is that I think there do appear to be such cases. Is that readable? No. Just as well, they're typos, so just as well. I can read it, that's all I need. So my short answer is that there probably are such positions, there are probably very few, but to me what's more important is that the burden of proof is on anyone who thinks there are such positions to state exactly what constraints are on that position in virtue of being an administrator. So let me just remind you of some things. So this is different from my laptop. There we go. Okay, great. So let me just, these points are already made by Neil Guppy, but let me, in a general way, let me just repeat them. So of course, freedoms are not unconstrained. Freedom of speech, for example, is constrained in lots of ways, depending on what roles we're in. So for example, if we're a government employee, there's lots of information that we can't make public. If we're in the private sector, there are lots of things we can't make public, such as trade secrets. There are also ways in which I'm not free to criticize my employer. Indeed, in Quebec, there's actually in the code a rule to the effect that you have an obligation of duty of loyalty to your employer. So, I mean, this is not surprising. There are constraints, and then the trick is to try to figure out how these constraints actually apply. Now, insofar as we are scholars at a university, we have a number of roles. We're teachers, we are administrators, and we're also employees. And so as an employee, we have certain obligations that might override what we might invoke academic freedom to protect us from. For example, teaching. We have to show up for that, but at the same time, unlike private sector employees, we do have the right through academic freedom to criticize administrative decisions. And we know that this is a fairly deeply held value from the events that took place in 2014 at the University of Saskatchewan when the dean of the School of Public Health was fired by the university for openly disagreeing with a policy put in place by the university. And then I think within a short period of time, an apology was forthcoming from the president of the university and the person was rehired. So we do understand that this is an important value that seems to be pretty widely shared. You wouldn't get that kind of turnaround if this were at all contentious. Each professor and librarian takes on administrative roles to a greater or lesser extent. So we're all involved in administration. So what I like to do is kind of consider two contrasting cases. So imagine a case one where you have a sardonic and provocative remarks made about the Minister of Education said by, sorry about the typo, on the one hand, the chair of my department, chair of linguistics, makes these comments, and on the other hand, the vice principal for communications and external relations. Well, I could see that those things would be perfect. I don't think there should be, anyone should even wince if that statement's made by the chair of the department, but I think lots of us would wince if it were made by the vice principal for communication and external relations. Or consider a letter to the editor written by a professor talking about or alleging the poor quality of research and low standards expected of students, sent to the newspaper by let's say, by me, as opposed to sent to the newspaper by the vice principal for university advancement. Again, I think we all want to say we really like to have some way of taking that person out of that position, but we don't want to say that that's going to apply to a university, just a sort of run-of-the-mill professor like me. So the conclusion is, suppose then that some administrative roles are constrained in their academic freedom. The first question is, how do we mitigate the risk that someone might be removed from an administrative position on grounds that we might consider spurious? So what can be put in place to mitigate that risk? And it seems to me, at the very least, we have to have something in place whereby these kinds of decisions can be reviewed by some independent body. And that independent body should be not only looking at things like that, but to my view, should be looking at broader issues connected with the problem of academic freedom within a university. Because it's not just decisions made by university administrators to relieve from their duties other university administrators, but there's also other questions about internal freedom of research and so forth, and pressures that may be put on people within a particular unit to do certain kinds of research. This should be something that should be open to question. So, to my knowledge, nothing like that exists at McGill. Something like that, it seems to me, should exist. There's an irony, it seems to me, or certainly a paradox, to have an institution which is characterized by institutional autonomy, this goes back to the Middle Ages, and internally characterized by academic freedom, and yet there's no way within the university itself to adjudicate issues when these come up within the university. So I think I made the time. So thank you very much.
I stay here. There's no point of going there for five minutes. So I will stick to the question. I think the question is perfectly clear. Is there a justification for imposing limits on what an academic administrator may say in publics? Limits that would not apply to regular professor in exercising his academic freedom. The question is clear, the answer will be clear and easy. The answer is perfectly yes, and for two obvious reasons, I think, in terms of obvious organizations. That first, there is a role of representation which is attached to a post like dean or VP research or president of the university. As has been mentioned, you can in theory imagine that it's separated. No one in society will make the difference when you call yourself a dean of a university. You are a dean of the university. Second, which is linked to the first, is linked to the credibility. If you want total academic freedom, it's very simple. You resign and you do like me. You are a simple professor. And those who know me knows that a lot of university presidents don't like to read in the newspaper what I say about universities. But I say that's your problem, and I will repeat it on the radio next week so you could listen to it, okay? But it's a decision I make. But when a dean of a university says that he wants his faculty to be independent of his university, to become independent of his university, then I say to the board, it's easy. The dean is an academic administrator named by the board, it should resign. And he could create his own business school somewhere. He's free to do that as a citizen, but as a dean, he's not free to say anything. It's quite obvious. And then now I will take a very interesting example I looked at for many years. It's in 1944, there is a physician named Gillen who wrote a book called The Medical Mafia, in which, as a physician, she explained that AIDS is not contagious, that vaccines are dangerous. And so the College of Physicians, after 3 years of going in court and everything, resigned her as a legitimate physician. She was no more considered a physician. What is interesting is that at the beginning of this debate in newspaper, journalists said, oh, it's incredible. Here's a physician that has no free speech. She cannot express her opinions about AIDS, about vaccines. And so the board of physicians said, but listen, when you are a physician, you have a credibility. And people who goes to see you says, I'm talking not to Gingras, a sociologist, I'm talking to a physician. So I want to know what is true, what is not true. And if she says as a physician, not as a citizen, as a physician, AIDS is not dangerous. It's in fact, it's an intentional plot, etc., etc. They said, okay, we have nothing against that she says that, but she has to resign as a physician. Because for this very simple reason that rights at any level, rights as a dean, rights as a physician, rights as a physicist, is always to be looked at in relation to responsibilities. And so a physician cannot say everything he thinks about in public. He has to take care of what is called the consensus of the medical community. And as has been mentioned in his talk, we can even imagine that a physics professor who teaches that the earth is flat will have problem with the physics department. Notwithstanding the very generous idea that, oh, it's an orthodoxy that the earth is round. And in orthodoxy, as good academics, could be discussed as we want. So in fact, as has been, I think, clearly showed in the presentation, there have always been limits to academic freedom, but here, the academic freedom of an administrator is not the same as one of the simple professor. We have the most freedom in the world because we have tenure, and I use it a lot in newspaper, and I know that if I become dean, I will have less. It's a decision you have to make. Thank you.
It's a pleasure for once to be able to talk about academic freedom at an intermediate or advanced level, not having to constantly reiterate the work that Neil so usefully did in the introduction, distinguishing academic freedom from general civil society freedom of speech and of expression. Those are points that always have to be reestablished in normal conversations. But I do think it's worth re-emphasizing, and here I'm going to adopt one of the possible positions that Neil laid out. I'm strongly an institutionalist and pluralist in his terms about what academic freedom means. That is to say, the core mechanism, the core institutionalization of academic freedom is the immunity of the scholar, be the scholar a professor or a student, the immunity of the scholar from adverse treatment by the institution on extra-disciplinary grounds. And that's twofold. That protects freedom of inquiry, and it protects something else. For freedom of inquiry, it means that work that is done according to good scientific standards, where the good scientific standards are relative to each of our communities of inquiry. That is, say, roughly speaking, they're disciplinary standards. Good work that is pursued according to the right methodological standards may not be impugned because it reaches unattractive conclusions from the perspective of the person doing the assessing. And this is true up and down the ladder. When I am reading a student paper, if the paper is well done according to the technical standards of the kind of work that I'm teaching, that it reaches a conclusion I don't like, normatively, interpretively, whatever, is no grounds at all for my assigning the student a bad grade. I violate the student's academic freedom if I do so. When we assess an assistant professor coming up for tenure with a substantial record of peer-reviewed published research whose conclusions systematically disagree with things that some of us among the tenured staff prefer, we violate the assistant professor's academic freedom if we deny them tenure on the grounds that their technically accomplished, methodologically correct research doesn't suit our preconceptions or preferred conclusions. If they're complying with the academic standards, with the disciplinary standards, then they are free to reach whatever conclusions their inquiries lead them to. But the freedom from adverse judgment on extra academic or extra disciplinary grounds is also a protection about what we do in our non-academic or partly non-academic lives. The core kinds of cases that generated a lot of the AAUP material in the 20th century were moments in which a professor who became known to be a communist or an atheist was put under pressure, the university was put under pressure to fire the professor on grounds of their communism or their atheism. To which the university's correct response was, they're doing their job as a professor. They're, as it were, extramural and personal beliefs, even their extramural and personal advocacy of those wildly unpopular beliefs. They are a non-academic, non-disciplinary standard. And the scholar faces absolute immunity from adverse judgment or punishment by the institution on grounds of their advocacy of views that are viewed as heretical, unorthodox, or merely unpopular in the wider political society as a whole. And again, that goes a whole way up and down the ladder. If I give a student in my class a bad grade because I read in the student newspaper that they're supporters of BDS or supporters of the student strike or supporters of some other cause I oppose, I violate their academic freedom. As students, their academic freedom demands that I judge them only on their performance according to the standards that are internal to the academic enterprise. Now, characterizing it all that way means that a lot of things that people sometimes talk about as being compromises or limits of academic freedom really aren't. They're outside the enterprise altogether. It is no compromise of academic freedom to punish a student for plagiarism or to expel and fire a professor for research fraud. Those are actions outside the relevant standards. They're violations of the relevant standards, and there's no immunity to punishment for violating the standards of inquiry that are appropriate to each of our respective communities of inquiry. That right of the individual scholar to be free from adverse judgment on extra-disciplinary grounds incorporates the pluralistic institutional shape of the university right into it. Discipline appears right in it. The standards have to be the standards of the self-governing communities of inquiry. Now, there are ways that in very nearly every modern university we limit the orthodox and conservative effect of the disciplines, but that's by and large to introduce multi or inter or sub-disciplinary centers and research groups that can put the thumb on the scale in favor of shifting the standards of the community of inquiry in one direction or another. You know, you emphasize this interdisciplinary center's advocacy of historical and normative inquiry or quantitative inquiry or something like that as a way to shift or constrain the disciplinary standards within the disciplines. For that whole system to work, disciplines, departments must be self-governing. They must have academic freedom as institutions. That system can't cohere if, say, department chairs can be fired on the grounds of their extramural communism or atheism. When the university comes under pressure from the donor, from the government, from the board of trustees, from the popular press, from Fox News, because a department chair has advocated a view that is, while irrelevant to the disciplinary standards of the discipline they govern, wildly unpopular. There's no way that if the university steps in and fires the chair on those grounds, that the discipline as a whole, the department as a whole, can carry on thinking that they have academic freedom as scholars. Because their academic freedom as scholars is deeply entangled with that of their research community. Now, that's a standard that I think does slightly attenuate as you go very high up the administrative and managerial system of a modern university. There are levels of unpopularity that become politically untenable, particularly for those officers whose statements will be unavoidably taken to be official statements of the university. The president in particular, or the principal instructor in particular of a university, and 1 to 1.5 tiers down from the level of the president. But for the subordinate units within the federation or confederation of communities of inquiry within a university, that immunity from adverse judgment has to protect the officers of those units in order to protect the integrity of the academic freedom of the units themselves. There's no way to credibly tell the department, oh, all of you professors still have your freedom to teach, all of you professors still have your freedom of research. But it so happens that we're going to keep firing your chairs one after another until we find one who doesn't offend the public, the donors, the government. That's simply not a credible balance to maintain. I mentioned the proliferation of units that aren't disciplines and departments, and the role they serve to some degree, check the propensity of disciplines and departments toward conservatism and orthodoxy. That is to say, programs, research groups, centers, institutes. What we do in a modern university is, while we organize the whole system on the foundation of disciplines, we then allow and encourage, by faculty governance, by the approval of our peers as scholars, the creation and the generation of other overlapping research units, communities of inquiry. Those don't trump the disciplines. You can't get tenure in a department on the grounds that the people in my center really like my research. You need to be writing enough peer-reviewed research where the peer review is very standardly disciplinary or subdisciplinary, not extra and multidisciplinary. But they do provide a space for meaningful communities of inquiry that can pursue other research agendas that partly overlap and partly shift those of the disciplines and departments. And just to the same degree that everything that I said about department chairs was true, it then applies, mutatis mutandis, to those who are directors or leaders or coordinators of these other non-departmental and non-disciplinary research units, still understood as communities of inquiry, that must articulate an internal standard in order to be a member in good standing of this center, this community of scholars, this collegium. You must engage in inquiry of this kind, not that kind. We, the Center for the Study of the Shape of the Earth, we don't have flat earthers here any more than the geology department has flat earthers. That's the shape of this community of inquiry. But once you've complied with that standard of inquiry, it's inappropriate to expel a member from a center on the grounds of their extramural unpopularity or heresy. And you cannot maintain the freedom of inquiry of that unit as a unit if those who are chosen, often by the colleagues themselves, to lead and to direct and organize those research units and communities of inquiry are subject to dismissal on non-academic extramural grounds. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to answer this question in the lens of my being a postmodernist scholar. And because I'm a postmodernist scholar, I'm going to talk a little bit about my positionality. So I'm going to talk about the fact that I normatively work with communities, marginalized communities, in the use of technology, hardware, software, data, and algorithms, and critique the technologically enablement or disablement of democracy. And as a part of that, I critique ostensible forms of openness and ostensible forms of democracy and proclamations of freedom. So when I come to a question like we have before us, I immediately ask myself, whose agenda does it serve to make the distinction between a person hired in the role of an academic and an academic? So one of the questions I ask, or one of the things I wonder is this a divide and conquer approach? Is this a way to privilege an elite and not others? Therefore, does it allow us to siphon off and allow people to criticize an elite? Does it increase a feeling of precariousness amongst an elite? Oh, I better not say certain things because I'm going to be subject to criticism. Whose agenda does this serve? Does it mean that if we're going to siphon off who is privileged with academic freedom, that librarians aren't covered? That an instructor in continuing education isn't covered? Or someone from the private sector who's hired to teach university students or fulfill the role of an academic, and that's already been echoed in this panel. Does it allow for the university to justify the hiring of more commentators because they will have to watch their steps? So this actually could benefit the university in the sense that maybe we need more of those because they're not subject to this expansiveness of pursuing wherever an idea takes you. It may also suggest that there are far too many non-academics in this role, and it could allow us an opening to criticize the proliferation of non-academics in roles previously held in the administration by academics. And it also implies that professors have some claim to a right of freedom, even though it also allows a university to not insufficiently define, at least in practice, what that means. I also want to talk about academic freedom around the issue of institutional autonomy, because we have talked a lot about the freedom for individuals, but what about institutional autonomy? Now, institutional autonomy is often posited as creating a bubble around a university to protect it from political influence by the state. But it also can be inferred as a way for a university to make nice with many stakeholders so it doesn't ruffle or pierce the bubble. So as with every higher education institution in the country, McGill is vulnerable to the province. They're also vulnerable to stakeholders like donors and parents. As with many high-powered higher education institutions, McGill may want to expand its offerings to establish satellite campuses in other countries. And the institution doesn't necessarily want to upset the host country or its laws or norms. So institutional autonomy can be defined as protecting the institution from political interference, but it can also be defined in a way that stifles your staff and students so they don't damage the brand. And I think that we can have principles and we can have norms, and I agree to the point that it's case-based, but also it's practical demonstrations of academic freedom. The proof is in the pudding, so we can exhort all we want, but if the university doesn't step up or steps up in certain dishonorable ways, I'd say that the principle of academic freedom is relatively gutless. So how would I define academic freedom? Because I'm looking at positionality and I am a postmodern scholar and fortunately or unfortunately heavily influenced by Foucault, I would say that it is the freedom to challenge the dominant ideology and not worry about political repercussions. It is about speaking truth to power, political power, albeit there is a responsibility of the academic not to make up false sources of power. Oh, I'm aggrieved, and therefore there's a power structure there. So, and I would also argue that it is an understanding that a freedom to pursue research wherever it takes you is an assumption that research is absent political power implications and policy implications. And from my positionality, I would argue that no matter what research or creative expression we do, it is never absent political implications. So we need to consider that as we pursue our own power, our own research. It's about speaking to open up dialogue and not speaking to stifle speech. So not research as chilling or research as bullying. To people who've already spoken about academic freedom balanced by academic responsibility, it is about academic freedom in compliance with Mertonian norms of communalism and organized skepticism. In other words, we must be responsible to those communities of inquiry. So it's research that can never be absent politics. It's also the notion that we can never establish principles. We also must have to rely on norms, which is not easy to negotiate. And it's also that the ability for us to do bottom-up management, this self-governance, as opposed to top-down imposition. Just to echo this point about not all ideals being equal, yes, the university is supposed to be a bastion of merit, to which I would add, yes, not all ideas are equal or worthy of pursuit, but in my lens, my question is, who's making this decision? The administration or the faculty. And I would also argue, and I'm thinking now about questions in climate science about red teams versus blue teams that's being done in the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, that arguments and that research must be done in good faith and not be disingenuous. And I'll end it there.
So as the sixth speaker on the panel, you reach the point where everything's been said, but not by me. I want to take 1 second to deplore the fact that the organizers of this event have yet again imposed the parlous norms of alphabetico-normativity, which relegate the W's amongst us to this sorry position. I'm afraid that what I'll have to say will therefore be sort of footnotes to some of the things that have been said by some of the speakers that have come before me, in particular Professors Levy and Gillen. I want to, as a philosopher, one of the things that we do is we pick nits on the way that questions are posed, and we return them to the people who have posed them by saying this is an ill-formed question. This is a pretty good question. There are ambiguities, though, that I'd like to speak to relative to three terms in the question. One is imposing. The other is academic administrator, and the third is public. So I'd like to spend a few minutes that I have. Other than that, you did a good job. I'd like to spend a little bit of time thinking about those three concepts. I'll go quickly on the concept of academic administrator, because I think that a lot of what Jacob Levy said really speaks to what I wanted to say. I'm the director of an institute, the Institute for Health and Social Policy. In that capacity, I do things like sign payroll forms so that people can get paid. I also administer tenure committees so that the academics for whom I have responsibility are fairly assessed when it comes to tenure and promotion. But I don't consider myself an administrator. If I were to quantify the amount of time I spend doing things that are strictly administrative, it would be certainly less than 50% of my time, well less than that. If not, I would not have accepted the position, because administration is not something that I do particularly well. A lot of the things that may be considered by some of the higher ups in the university to be administration administration, I consider to be the carrying out of properly academic functions. I organize research. I look for ways in which the academics who are within the nebula of the Institute for Health and Social Policy might collaborate across disciplines in ways that they might not have thought of. I apply for funding for some of these perhaps more out-of-the-box projects and write grant applications, which could not probably be written by a straight administrator. In other words, and I do my own research. In other words, what I do as a strict administrator is very, very little. I consider myself to be an academic and an academic foremost, and I think that a lot of the positions, excluding the ones that Jacob referred to as the president and 1.5 tiers down, I think that most of us who carry out academic functions, administrative functions, view ourselves as academics who do administration as a necessary contingent sort of sideline of what they do, and would be very surprised indeed were they to find out that they were considered as full academic administrators with the same kinds of responsibilities vis-a-vis the rest of, when they speak, as, say, the president of the university. That just isn't part of the implicit contract, and perhaps to the extent that there is ambiguities about that contract, those things ought to be made explicit. I want to say something about the word public, which surprisingly has not been talked about as much as I thought that it might have in this context. There's something in the middle between the strictly academic work that we do when we publish in academic journals or when we give talks to learned gatherings, and the kinds of things that Jacob Levy was talking about when he spoke about the department chair, who is a communist in his spare time. There are the things that someone like I do fairly often. As a matter of fact, in the last few days, I've been doing it more often than I'm really very happy with. Whenever governments do things like Bill 62, my phone rings off the hook. And the feeling that I get from the administration is that they're happy that I pick up the phone rather than, say, oof, there are risks there. Were I to say something like, I will never enforce Bill 62 in my classroom, I may fall afoul of the favor of powerful politicians who may then, look askance upon the university because of something I've said. I get the feeling that, by and large, the higher-ups are happy that I don't succumb to that pressure. So that kind of public utterance that some of us are in the business of, a fair degree of what we do, and that the university sends all kinds of signals out to us that they're happy that we do this, I think should be fully covered by academic freedom. And it should be realized that those of us who carry out that role will often take risks that are not taken by people who have the luxury of being able to think twice, thrice, 4 times, and 5 times about what they send off to the academic journal, because the news cycle requires that if they respond at all, they respond right now. I hope that we do better than most even very good baseball players in hitting better than 300, 400, or even 500, but batting 1,000 is something that is impossible, and to expect it and to impose sanctions upon people who do not bat 1,000 in carrying out that role, I think, is something that is completely unreasonable. Have I entirely run out of time in talking about public? And so I was going to talk about imposing. Implicit in the verb imposing is someone does the imposing. Were someone, hypothetical example, to write an article in a popular medium that were judged to be, by many people in the academic community that is directly related to that article, subpar. The appropriate way in which we govern ourselves as an academic community is for those people to use the channels through which we discipline ourselves as communities of inquiry, to say, no, you really were off the mark this time, and for the management of that situation to be dealt with, as it were, intramuros. I think, we are pretty good, actually, at doing that and at policing ourselves and in making it known to our colleagues who have sometimes, gone beyond what the evidence or what the arguments allow in making public utterances that they have not satisfied criteria that we deem to be scientifically acceptable. And the universities should protect the practice through which we govern ourselves in that way. Once a public utterance becomes grounds for somebody's work, not as an academic, but as an administrator,
to be judged as wanting, then I think we run into real trouble. If I were to deliver my tenure reports to the relevant authorities regularly very late, such that I put my charges at risk, were I to forget to sign the payroll form such that the people that work in the Institute don't get paid on time, then I think that the administrators within the university who oversee administrative tasks could properly call me to account, and were I to do this repeatedly, perhaps dismiss me of my functions. For anything that I say to count as something that counts against me as an administrator, I think is a very dangerous category mistake. Thank you.
Thank you to the panelists for their inspiring and thoughtful comments. In the first instance, I want to allow interaction amongst panelists if you want to reflect on things that your colleagues have said, and then we can open the floor to questions as well. We can integrate the two parts. Yves, please.
Yes, I think I will start because I was shorter. I was shorter for the simple reason that I answered the question. And if you read the question carefully, the question is not about academic freedom. The question is about whatever the definition of academic freedom can be, is it the same for the usual professor as the academic? But we, as you said, we are used with university people that they are always brighter than the average. So we have reorder the question, change the question, not answer the question. So I will come now to what was not the question, but has been discussed about academic freedom. But I want first to say a small word about a word that I use that has not been taken back, that I think is very important. Is that there is a difference between individuals and institutions. So I talk as looking at that as a sociologist, not about my view about academic freedom. I have a view, but everyone has, and I'm not interested in that. We don't have the time to do that. But as an institution, we have to understand what it is to be a representative. So when I hear that, oh, I don't consider myself as an administrator when I do this and that, this has no importance at all. You cannot consider yourself as something, but you will perceive socially as doing that role. And you can say, oh, why do they think that? Then go back to sociology. As has been said by Neil, the president of the university can be saying, oh, why do they think I insisted? I'm talking about an individual, and they still see me as a university president because I have the act of the university. So my analysis is about what will be perceived at, and you can bet the money you want, university will react because you are perceived as being a representative when you're dean. I'm not talking about the head of a department because it's very complicated. It depends on universities. In my university, the head of the chair of the department is a professor. He's not an administrator in the sense of, because he has no power. And in some universities, the dean will decide that you get your tenure. And he will even decide that what you do is peer review, excellent, but you know, it's not the kind of work we like today. So it would be going far in that direction. I insist on one thing. When we talk about administrator, dean, VP, we talk about a representative. And the university makes this decision right or bad. I'm not saying it's a good decision. I'm saying it will make the decision because its own credibility is at stake. And on which basis it will be made? It will depend. If people say, okay, this guy is supposed to be an academic, supposed to have a PhD, learn the difference between words, and he's kind of talking nonsense. Suppose it's an invented case. Well, you can say it's not nonsense, but if most people who know how to read a sentence will say it's nonsense, then the university will put it on vacation or somewhere else. Okay, maybe some will disagree, they will go on a committee to decide, but at the end of the day, they will make that decision. So the answer of the question, we have to distinguish. Now we can say what should be academic freedom. And in all cases, and I totally agree, it's a casuistic case. The Jesuits invented that. Casuistic is the only way to do it because each case is different. Take the case in the United States of Brian Jones, of Stephen Jones, who was at Brigham Young University as a physicist. You know, on his spare time, he's convinced that the Twin Tower, has been exploded by the CIA, etc. But he can do that, and no one should say he should not be a university professor because he's doing a course of physics. So he should be kept as a physics professor. Even some asked for his resign. But people said, but look, he's doing his physics job. Of course, he has this crazy idea that the CIA exploded the tower, but this is, he can do as a citizen. I have no problem with that. But to think that when you are an administrator, even you think that yourself, you don't see yourself as different from an academic, then go back to what an organization is. And when you're the president of the union, you cannot say anything as president of a union because you're now different from a dean, a thing like that. I'm only saying that, and it's very important to remember that. Now, who will make the decision? Easy. In each organization, there's an organization, and at the end of the day, it's the board. I sit on the board of UCAB. When something comes, we have to make a decision. It's based on the case, we look at the committees, and at the end of the day, we decide. We say, okay, here, the student did this, he went on this committee, we decided to give him a chance to go back to school, but if he does the same thing of going against the rule of the university, he will be out of the university. Who decided that? The committee of the university. Each institution has its rule. I'm just saying that if you believe that you don't understand the rules, don't take the jobs which comes with the rules.
Thank you. Any other reflections?
I don't think that those are new and marginal cases. I think they're traditional and core cases. How can your university tolerate that there's an atheist professor? After all, how can students feel that their moral character isn't going to be corrupted by having an atheist who presumably, tacitly, even if not explicitly, is going to be undermining the religion that is the foundation of all of their morality? That's one of the traditional core cases in response to which the AAUP guidelines were articulated. Once admitted as a kind of consideration, once the university says, yes, in response to popular concerns about the moral character of this person's extramural speech, we are going to allow that to enter into, for example, the question of whether they're a good enough teacher, whether they're a trustworthy teacher, then the game's been given away. And the game's been given away because it's an ongoing strategic game. And this, I want to say something about what Yves said as well. What people perceive as going with the job is partly endogenous to what the institutions do. When the institution says, you're right, it's a real problem that we have an atheist professor because it's an embarrassment to the university, they're fired, they've announced the general principle. The individual professor's views do represent the university. They do count as an embarrassment. Once that's been admitted as a principle, the game is over. By contrast, with a credible commitment, even a costly credible commitment in game theoretic terms, it says, yes, we're going to turn away these donors. We're going to let these trustees leave in a huff because we stand by the principle that the individual professor's views do not represent the university. The university doesn't have views about the existence or non-existence of God. The university is just a background framework for those communities of inquiry. Once the credible commitment's been made and carried out, people's perceptions about whether the professor speaks for the university adjust accordingly. The same is true at administrative levels. It's not just kind of a natural fact that somebody with a fancier job title than professor will be perceived to be speaking for their whole unit or for the university as a whole. Whether that perception holds depends on whether the university is willing to make a strong commitment to the contrary position. Over and over again, in response to social media storms, saying the university does not and will not impair the freedom of criticize, express a view about the substantive content of our academic staffs or our students' public speech, because of course they don't speak for the university, because the university doesn't do that kind of thing. The only way to protect, I think, any meaningful fraction of academic freedom is for the university to be willing to engage in costly, credible commitment to insist that the outside world update their perceptions about who does and who doesn't speak for the university as a whole, not to treat those perceptions as giving the university reason to discipline people internally.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give a chance to questions from the audience because Jacob has to leave to teach in
I have to leave. Jacob,
I'm sorry. Daniel has to leave, and if there are questions to him, I would like him to be here to answer. Mark, please.
Actually, is this working? It's. This is actually a comment more than a question, so maybe someone else wants to go first, or
If it's a quick comment, you can do it.
it's not that quick.
Okay, so maybe, Bruce, is yours a question? Is there a question that needs to be asked, and Daniel might be the possible respondent, because I want to give him the chance to be here if there are any questions.
I feel very self-conscious now.
You are doing your job. Yes, you have to go teach. Yes, Ken?
Yeah, it was interesting that I can't tell if this is on. I don't.
It is.
Oh, it is. Okay, fine. Yes, you said you don't feel like an administrator, and you kind of addressed it in terms of how much time you spend on it.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether, Eve, you seem to disagree with the idea that, like, it doesn't matter what he thinks. He's an administrator, right? So is there a standard where we could say, do you think it's a way to proceed to say we can distinguish between people who might be considered administrators based on how much time they spend doing it? Is that at all practical, do you think?
No, and Eve was right to catch me up on that. You know, the time factor, that was a very sort of subjective way of assessing. I think that, look, could everything that I do at an administrative level, signing the endless, you know, salary forms that I have to sign, be done by someone non-academic? Absolutely, right? The reason that I take it, the reason that I was named as director of the Institute for Health and Social Policy, the reason that I was named founding director of the center that I ran at the University of Montreal for a decade, had nothing to do with my administrative prowesses. I can assure you. They had to do with a perception on the part of the authorities of both universities, a perception which was based on an assessment of what I take to be irreducibly academic capacities that I might have as an organizer of research, as someone who could be a research leader. And I take that to be a purely academic job. When I said that the administrative tasks were sort of contingently related to them. What I meant is that the reasons that sort of, and the criteria that were used to select me, that will be used to select my successor as director of the Institute for Health and Social Policy, are academic criteria, because it is an academic position to be doing the kind of academic organization and academic leading that being the director of an institute or a center involves. The amount of time spent is, you're right, a distraction to that main point.
Just maybe a brief answer. There's a confusion. We're not talking about administration in the sense of signing things. We're talking about a representative position. In sociological terms, if I am the head of the department of the Center of Islamic Studies, and I go on TV and I just say I'm Yves Gingras, and then I say, no, I'm the director of Islamic Studies, and I say something very bizarre for an expert in Islamic Studies. If someone here believes for 1 second that the university will say, oh, there's no problem, it's academic freedom. No, they will say, okay, you're the director of the Institute of Islamic Studies. You're not Yves Gingras, simple professor. So I'm not talking administration in that sense.
Sure.
I'm thinking in the sense of you have an academic position, and a position comes with a visibility and a responsibility. I'm not for or against. It's basic organizational sociology.
So I can't say that in 15 years of being the director of organizations, I have ever come across anybody, be it another academic or even people who see me on television, when my name appears with director of the Institute for Health and Social Policy, and I put out a position saying, oh, is that what the Institute thinks? It has never, ever, ever happened. And because people are actually pretty good at parsing, what it means when it says underneath your name on the television, Director of the Institute for Health and Social Policy. Now, were I to say, as Director of the Institute for Health and Social Policy, that vaccination is a plot by the Russians to undermine morals, I would expect the board that oversees, the activities of the Institute to look at this very, very harshly and to wonder on academic grounds whether I can continue to do my job, and whether next time my leadership comes into question, whether I would think that to be perfectly appropriate. What I wouldn't take to be appropriate would be for those utterances to be deemed sufficient for people who are not in a position to make academic judgments about what I do. I've lost that sentence. Sufficient grounds for people who are not academics or not in my discipline to say, on administrative grounds, this person is no longer capable of running. Will there be sanction? Yes, I will be sanctioned by my peers. Is it appropriate that I be sanctioned by people who claim to be judging me on administrative grounds? No.
You won't be censored by peers. Peers is a vague term. You will be sanctioned by the authority of the university. That's it.
Rene?
McGill has its own problem. It's probably a problem in other universities as well, in that at the same time, we want university administration to be full of academics, but I think we're very ambivalent about whether university administrators should retain academic freedom. And I don't think necessarily that university administrators, well, it's not easy to make the distinction between where your academic freedom ends, right? I'm talking irrespective of what title is in the chyron underneath your name. That in fact MAUT has this issue where we don't make a worker-employer distinction. We say even if you go into administration, you're an academic, you still are a member of MAUT. So I think it warrants a further discussion on what is the academic freedom of administrators in a university in which the administrators feel they have academic freedom.
Maybe we go to Mark now.
Thank you to all the speakers. It's been extremely interesting. As I said, this is a comment, and it pertains to a subject that was mentioned in the keynote address, which is the concept of aspirational statements. In my opinion, the fundamental weakness of McGill's statement of academic freedom is the fact that it's a statement. Is this working? Okay, yes. Right. In my opinion, the fundamental weakness of McGill's statement of academic freedom is the fact that it's a statement. Under our governance structure, statements may sound nice, but they have no defined status. And by a very odd coincidence, just a couple of weeks ago, this lack of status was formalized by the Board of Governors when it adopted a framework on governance documents, which I only found out about this morning. This document spends 2 pages defining in considerable detail policies, regulations, codes, charters, procedures, directives, and guidelines. It doesn't mention statements. Statements have no status at McGill. This is a new document. It is, however, not a new concern. This particular concern was raised in Senate in March 2016 when the Statement of Academic Freedom was adopted. And the provost at the time, in response to that concern, said that future changes to governance documents such as regulations and policies will be made with reference to the principles which are defined in the statement. Since that time, I'm not aware of that ever occurring, or at least not to any significant degree. In the sense, by significant, I mean having the statement on academic freedom hardwired into our regulations and policies. And that's the fatal flaw, because regulations and policies are enforceable, statements are not.
I'm going to start with a question, but it's rhetorical. Where does the word academic come from? It comes from Plato's Academy, where the Socratic method was taught. And I think that's a good place to start when we think about what academic freedom means. And you know, Socrates was silenced because his teachings were not within the accepted norms of his discipline at the time. But I don't think that that's where we should look in the definition. You know, instead, I'd like to suggest that, as with the original academy, our principal purpose is to foster independent thinking in our students. And that means that giving them the freedom to get things wrong. Right? So, and anybody who's been a grad student will know that that's what happens. Okay? So academic freedom stems from this mission. It's not about getting things right, it's about having the freedom to get things wrong. So I disagree with the core theme of Professor Guppy's speech, which was that academic freedom arises because of the value to society, professors' discoveries, and transmission of the truth. This has nothing to do with the academy. This can happen at a research institute. It can happen anywhere. What's specific about the academy is our training mission. Right? And that the freedom rests fundamentally on the fact that nobody outside the academic community has the expertise to pass judgment on whether a professor has gotten it right. And hence, as a corollary, that those within the academy that do have that expertise can put limits on it. You know? I would suggest that academic freedom is a freedom to be wrong, as I said. Students need this freedom in order to develop their independent thinking, and it needs to permeate the academy if there is an atmosphere which will allow them to do so. And if we take that as the foundation of academic freedom, then collegial governance begins to make sense. Then saying things aren't going to come from the top down makes a lot more sense. If things come from the top down and we're told what's going to happen, that's not flowering of people's cells. It prevents it. So I would suggest that the collegial governance stuff also makes a lot more sense if you take this as a foundation of academic freedom. And I'd welcome any comments.
Thank you.
So Bruce, don't go away yet. So this is an honest question. Do you believe that any academic who does not have students does not have academic freedom?
No, because I mean, you think of the university as a model of society in which students are learning. So you want that model of society to have, in a sense then, you want to have you could argue that there should be more free speech, not that academic freedom is less free speech than in the rest of the world, but actually it's more. Because if these students are trying to learn how to think and how to behave, there has to be more space for mistakes. And so that, and it's not just the students, that whole sort of way the university works should have that freedom in it, because it's got to be felt all over.
And I have a second question. So I do a computerized mapping. It's called geographic information science. And that field has been upended by what's called neo-geography and software engineers who say geography is nothing but two columns, an X and a Y, and we can do geospatial analysis better than geographers. And I have students come in and say, well, I have all these tools, so I don't need any of your research. So where is the role of expertise in research and my ideas are better than my students' ideas?
I wasn't expecting the question from your lead up. I'm not sure I understood completely what you were saying. I mean, can you try and...
So, if you maybe related to the academic freedom topic, maybe that would be more exciting. If academic freedom is the marketplace of ideas and I create an open-ended free exchange of ideas with my students, do I have, what is the role of curtailing the freedom of the students?
Well, I mean, again, if you look back, I mean, again, it's the standard response, right? Is that the right ideas will win, I guess, or that they will come to realizations themselves, right? You know, so as a professor, I don't think, you know, the thing to do is to say, I'm the professor, so I'm right. It's, you know, to get them to come to the understanding of what's right, and you may be wrong.
But,
you know,
but you set a syllabus. You don't just say, go run free through the library, think thoughts, some of them will be wrong. You try to create an environment in which certain kinds of wrongness will be discovered. will be corrected, will be exposed, that there will be building on. Your way of describing the problem abandoned any idea of improvement and correction, and that there being any value in the structure of the inquiry, whether the inquiry is
I'm not sure there is any value. We do it that way because we can't, let people go off on themselves and interact with them one-on-one. In my view, the only reason that we do it that way is because we have to teach 30 or 40 or 400 students at the same time, and there's no other option. I don't really think that there's a lot of value from that structure.
Okay, I think we're getting away from the core idea of this conversation. Yves?
I have one that is at the center of this academic freedom that I want to mention before we close. And it has been raised, I was glad by Neil at the end, is that he, as Neil said, some of his colleagues and our colleagues mentioned, and it happened to me a lot of times, that now the most important problem that want to limit, consciously or unconsciously, I don't impute motivation, but I observe the consequences, is the ethics research boards. It's perfectly obvious that in many cases they have crossed the line between checking if the research is ethical to commenting on my research project that has been passed through all the system that the peers want, and that I ask you this question, and now I have colleagues, and the fact that they want even the three council policy, read carefully, as a philosopher would do, word by word, chapter 9, about the limitations of research when you talk about First Nations or anything. And just think about the same chapter where you will say, you will give the same right, a symmetry with Monsanto. Just read it with Monsanto. Try it. Okay? I did the test with students and people. Just try it. I don't give you the answer. So we have a big problem now. We don't look there. We look at the limitation of academic freedom at institutions, the bad board that want to limit our research. It's not there it comes from. Now, for a couple of years, more and more mounting cases, I could give you a lot of empirical cases. Believe me, that's the main problem I have now, and my university have, my colleagues have, about academic freedom, is that with, l'enfer est pavé de bonnes intentions. Hell is paved with good intentions. Yeah. That's the word that I think define the work, the day-to-day work of the boards now in Canadian universities.
But I think you can also extend it to the panels that adjudicate social science research, that there is a lot of ideological differences, and based on that, grants might get poor reviews rather than on methodological basis or conceptual basis. Anyway, that's another discussion for another time. Brendan, did you want to say something? No?
Too many things to clarify. That's food for thought.
John, I see you coming to the mic.
Thank you all for a very spirited and interesting discussion with a whole range of views presented. I take away that there were two, let's say, I don't want to say extremes, but the ends of the spectrum are represented by Professor Gingras, who's basically saying, no, we definitely have limitations, at least at the few top levels of administration, and Professor Weinstock, who basically said, even if you have a position, essentially what you do as a member of the academy are things academic. So I've learned from both of you, but I want to ask a sort of pragmatic question. Professor Gingras, you stated that if there's something wrong, the university will respond. How precisely will the university respond? You've evoked the board, the role of the board, and of course, ultimately that's the decision maker. But one of the things I would hate to see is that other officers of the university are listening to what we're saying, and I hope they're listening to what we're saying, but listening in a critical way to intervene. And of course that in recent months is what we saw. Basically, I don't like this. And of course, any statement like that, no matter where it is at the level of the hierarchy of the university, is illegitimate, because the person is not able to speak on behalf of an institution. They're simply giving an opinion. And I would hate to think, and this I think bends my point of view back towards Professor Weinstock and that point of view. I would hate to think that we would consider the process in the university to be basically one of surveillance and intervention to say, you've just crossed a line. And that's what I think the position that you've articulated suggests. And I don't know if there's a difference between UQAM's structure of governance. I think there may be from McGill, and that may be worth talking about.
So I feel exposed when I'm told I'm on an extreme, so I want to, you know, I'm a Canadian, I want to bring myself back towards the middle. So I did agree about, you know, what Jacob termed to be the sort of 1.5 levels down from the president, right? So I think there are people who can't but see themselves as speaking for the university. The other thing is, I mean, there's an elephant in this room, and I won't name it, but I didn't hear from anybody, including the people, including Eve, who was, you know, the kinds of examples that Eve gave as warranting perhaps stepping in had to do with, you know, people saying like just completely insane things, like denying the effectiveness of vaccines, or or saying that AIDS was not an infectious disease. I mean, you know, I think at no point did I hear, even from people with whom on principle I sort of maybe disagree, that the kinds of utterances that were made in the case that is the occasion for us having this discussion, is that sufficiently sort of fall within the ambit of the sorts of things that are kind of like denying AIDS, you know, as an infectious disease, or the flat Earth, or you know, vaccines being a communist plot. So you know, I think that we have selection methods that are robust enough such that we pretty much are effective in making sure that people do not occupy positions of academic leadership who would utter such preposterous. So we're, you know, so what I'm saying is, were it the case that there were somebody, you know, in a leadership position saying sort of things that are clearly insane, you know, there might be more agreement at this table than I'm getting myself. Yeah, there appears to be, because I didn't hear any disagreement that might, you know, at the level of principle, that might lead us to have different views about the case that shall not be named, that, you know, is the one that kind of brings us together here today. That's what I was wanting to say.
I think that what I'm saying is just about, not that we have to agree or not, is that it's always based on judgment. Then we may, in a particular case, decide that we will disagree that they will do that. And there's a different thing between saying, oh, I disagree with that, and saying that, don't make a fuss. They will make who will make it? The organization. They may make a wrong decision on bad judgment, because it's a power struggle. So when you say, oh, this may suggest that we will check you, no, in academic they don't do that. But it means that when it goes over the board, they will do that. I'm just saying, if you take a position which is perceived as representative of something, people like to say, oh, I've got this prize, I got this thing. So when you do that, you use your symbolic capital, okay? So when you decide to do that, then you have to pay with the consequences. Or don't use for example, it happens, I write in the newspaper, if I write just a small letter, I write Yves Gingras, Montreal. Okay, because I say, okay, I'm a real pure citizen, it's not my expertise. When I wrote a full page, you know, the one with my with Chair Canada, I say, I have an expertise in sociology of science, I know rhetorics, I know sophistry, and I know how to deconstruct that. And that's what I do when I sign it. Okay, people may disagree with this. So I don't think it will be une chasse aux sorcières. It's just to be aware that if you sit on a given place in the structure, you should be aware where you are sitting and the consequence of it. So I see no problem with that. And in the case that we were talking about, I could understand that people disagree about the name we are not supposed to talk. And I wrote a very detailed analysis in the newspaper on this, saying that it was not about that case, I don't give a damn. It was about the decline of university and what it means to choose a certain kind of people in the university, because I am defender of the autonomy of university and not transforming it into newspaper op-ed places. And there I could agree that it was a good decision, and even if I thought it was bad, and could have predicted that given what McGill want to be perceived as, they would have done that. Even if we can disagree that McGill should not be presented himself or herself this way, if they see them this way, take the judge 2 days ago in Quebec. There is a judge who has been found to say to a young woman, oh, you're big a bit, but you're beautiful. There will be a problem because the judge says anything when, and this stupid judge says, oh, you know, you're big enough, but you're pretty. So there will, this guy is crazy, he should be out. He's not a judge, he's just an old boy, stupid guy, okay? But he will have to answer to that. As a citizen, he could say that, not as a judge. So I say the same thing. Every position has consequences, and we have to live with it, or defend ourselves from it. If the university wants to shut me out, of course I will ask a few friends to help me. And as he says, very few people do in practice defend their colleagues. We can come back to that later.
Rene, just a short comment because I'd like to give Neil a chance to sum up our comments.
I have a question about insanity.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Is that part of
I nitpick with your point about insanity.
In a non-technical sense of the term.
We have to rely on the norms of the institution to decide what is inside and outside the boundaries, what's considered to be insane. And it's not an easy thing to negotiate. Why? I am a woman professor. How many years ago would that be considered insane?
Okay, with that profound question, I'm going to ask Neil to give his insights and summarize, if he can, the array of comments.
So I'm going to pick up on the if he can. He can't, and I don't want to pretend that I can. So I'm going to make just a couple of very brief remarks, and I'll be honest, I heard lots of different good ideas, and I'm not sure which I agree with and which I disagree with. So this will be a bit of a jumble as I go through here. I must also confess that I'm embarrassed by this. I didn't notice that I was going to actually respond until I read this on the agenda. So anyway, enough said. So I want to start with a remark that Eve made and that Ken, in some sense, asked at the very, very beginning. How do we actually define, what are the kind of parameters here? And at least at UBC and how I understand it, and I think it would be the same here at McGill, it's what's in the collective agreement, what's in the understanding that, and I don't even know if McGill's unionized, I'm sorry, but that the practices that the university has typically engaged in would become the labor standards that would apply, and that's where a decision would be made. So before UBC became unionized, as we now are, it was a standard set of practices that the university, the Faculty Governance Council, I think it was called, before it became a union, and the university would discuss and bargain over, et cetera. That's where someone would try to make a decision as to, well, where is the 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3? It would get defined very, very concretely in that kind of way. So I like that. Obviously, I agree with Eve's distinction between individuals and institutions, and I think sociologists talk about that all the time, and kind of like that. I like Jacob's point. At one point, we're sort of thinking, you know what's going on here? This is what I wrote down as grounds for disciplining, right? So how ought we be making decisions about this? And it comes back to the question, I guess, of what is an academic administrator and how do we define exactly what that is, et cetera. So I think you get put in those positions not just because you're a good academic. You get put in those positions because you're a good academic that has good judgment. And when you're making decisions around leadership and administration, there may well be sanctions that apply because you've done a bad job doing that. But when you're making academic types of decisions and acting as an academic in terms of your public speech, then it seems to me that there ought to be no sanctions that get applied there. So I'm kind of thinking, I can't do this very well, but there's a sort of matrix here that there are different kinds of things that may or may not apply depending on exactly where you are on that hierarchy. And just, anyway, maybe I should just leave it there. I think the other part of all of this is I think academic freedom is a traditional conservative force within the university, and I do think that at some sense I lauded 1915 and said this was a good statement and it's moved us along quite a ways. Maybe it is well timed that we thought about this in a more modern context and talked about the ways in which academic freedom does act in too traditional a way. And then the notion of the McGill statement as an aspirational statement, I think I'm absolutely with you. I mean, we have this statement at UBC, and just as I was leaving to get on the plane, we were disciplining one of my staff colleagues in education because he was a whistleblower. And I think, holy moly, how does academic freedom not apply to this case, given how we define it at UBC? So the notion that we've got these statements and they just don't apply, oh, wow, it happens way, way, way too often. And finally, the comment about failure, kind of, as that was mentioned, I wrote down in my notes here, those within the academy have freedom to get things wrong. And I thought, hey, this is very Popperian. And I agree with that. But I think that is what academic freedom is all about. But in getting things wrong, we hope that we're moving towards greater understanding, progress, better judgment, etc. So that doesn't sum up anything. And my apologies for not summing up anything. But thank you for lots of great comments that the panel had, and I have very much enjoyed myself and written lots of good notes that I will make good use of in future comments. Thank you.
Thank you, and sorry for that surprising added responsibility.
That was totally my fault. Didn't read what I was supposed to do.
I've asked Haskell to maybe comment on what does this mean for MAUT, the steps that we might need to consider and take as we go forward.
And I'm also an academic, and I also don't read what I'm supposed to be doing. I didn't realize that I was going to talk about moving forward. I have no idea how to move forward. And after this discussion, I even have less of an idea about moving forward. No, I'm joking. I initially, during an executive committee meeting where we organized this event, Annelouche sort of offhand said, so I'll open up and I'll introduce them, and then you will synthesize at the end. And at that moment, I thought, nothing of it. And then as the event was approaching, I was realizing, how on earth am I going to synthesize these guys with all their different opinions? The only synthetic thing you can say about it is that it's complicated. But it turns out, actually, having heard all of these people make their different pitches, there are clearly significant differences between them, particularly with respect to the case that shall not be named, but at the same time, there are clearly some themes that are emerging that we can use, actually, I hope, to move forward. Obviously, the ultimate aim of this event is to get a conversation starting within MAUT about what kind of position, if any, we should be taking with respect to the specific question that we raised today, and that we raised for the very obvious reason that it is the distinction that the university administration has relied on most heavily in its justification of its actions in the case that shall not be named. And I do think there are some things here that you've said and that you've emphasized that will give us some guidelines as to where to start thinking and in which direction to think our way through to a defensible position. I think the main theme that comes across from several of you is, I think, that the core of the notion of academic freedom is, I think Jacob said it maybe most clearly, but all of you in one way or another subscribe to this, I think. The core notion is that research, and perhaps teaching as well, should be pursued according to the criteria of the community of inquiry that has that particular research or that particular teaching in its domain. Those are the criteria that should be applied, and only the members of that, the recognized members of that community of inquiry are qualified to make judgments about the validity and the quality of that teaching and of that research. And that from that it follows that no extraneous criteria and no irrelevant or non-relevant factors should impact on the nature of that activity. That's really what it is all about, right? That's a good starting point, because now, beyond that, Jacob and Daniel in particular have made the argument that if you're a lowly administrator, most of your work has to do with enhancing, encouraging, helping in doing the kind of work that has to do with research and teaching that should be immune to influence, to undue influence from the outside. And that being the case, most of the things that administrators do are things that should be covered by academic freedom, and their administrative position should not be at risk for doing those kinds of jobs, right? So far, so good. Now, of course, the job that we have to do is to see whether there are other kinds of administrative jobs that could be defined, or other aspects of the administrative job that fall outside of that particular domain of competence, that have other criteria of effectiveness or efficacy or proper conduct, and that for which administrators can possibly be demoted if they are not performing their tasks in those respects. Are there such aspects of the administrative positions? And if so, how can they be defined? And that's, of course, Brendan's point, right? That if there are such aspects of lower administrative positions, then we have to think about how they could actually be anticipated so that a director or a chair of a department does not feel that he's whistling in the dark and doesn't know whether or not there are things that he or she can say that would endanger their administrative position. So I think that's a couple of steps forward. Not a hell of a lot. I mean, there is still quite a lot of thinking to be done, but we certainly owe you guys, thank you very much. Alanouche already said that we have an incredible panel. We do have an incredible panel. Thank you very much. I want to thank, of course, especially those who've come from either very far outside McGill, such as Yves Gingras, or those who come from a little closer, like Vancouver, or Toronto. I thank you all very, very much for having come here, having shared your very important insights into the problématique. That I hate the Englishification of the word problématique. Problématique means something quite specific in French, and the English have mashed it up in a problematic, right? I thank you all very much for coming here. I promise you that there will be an internal discussion that will be ongoing, of which many who are still sitting here will be a part within MAUT to try and forge some sort of defensible position with respect to this issue that we can then take towards the McGill administration, of which we are the collegial governors, it so happens. Okay, thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, our audience and our panel. There's a bar in Old McGill, so I hope that you can take a few minutes to chat informally with each other. And I'm sure we're going to draw on the expertise of individuals as we move along in our discussions about this important matter. Thank you.